I am here joined with two of my favorite STR speakers. How you boys doing?
Man, I'm doing great. It's been a
Yeah.
good day. Yeah.
Now, has this affected, we've got events canceled, but when you're home and you're not traveling speaking, is this like your typical routine? You're kind of stuck at home working from the home office, this kind of thing. How much is, this whole COVID-19 affected your schedule?
Yeah. I mean, for me, well, for our family, not much has changed. Like you
Yeah.
said, I mean, obviously all of my trips in March and April have been canceled, and now a few now in May as well. But when I'm not traveling, I'm at home. We homeschool.
Yeah.
So my wife's at home, my kids are at home, they're doing schoolwork. I'm at home writing, working here in the office, working around the house, helping with homeschooling. So in some senses, very little has changed in our day to day.
Yeah.
But obviously, all our travel's been canceled.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same for me.
Yeah.
So it's actually been, my wife and I were just talking about it today. It's been kind of nice, actually, having the slowdown. Our kids, we do a hybrid program for their school. So we do 2 days of homeschool, 3 days of full-time school. So we drop them off. But it's been super nice on the days that they don't have to go to school to not have to make their lunch, or, I mean, they get up at the same time. The kids get up early, but it's been real slow and nice. Other than the cancellations, I don't like, and all the speaking, which has been kind of hard. But for the most part, I'm having a good time, man. What about you, Tim?
Good. Yeah. Don't your kids go to school?
Same old. We're busier at home than usual because our kids are supposed to go to a Christian school. But so now we're picking up the slack there, although the school has been great and they're providing all kinds of online education. But I could shoot the breeze with you guys for hours, but we got a job to do.
We're over here. I thought we were just gonna have a little three-way chat here.
We're waiting for people to hop on. I see some people getting into the chat, which is amazing. For those who are just joining us, my name is Tim Barnett, and I'm joined here with Alan Shlemon and Jonathan Noyes, and we are all speakers with Stand to Reason. And since we're in lockdown now, we can't travel. Events have been canceled because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we've been coming up with new strategies and ways of speaking and reaching out to the church at large. And so one of the things that we're doing is we put together an STR book club. And one of the books that we want to study is this one here. It's you may be familiar with the author, you may not be. It's Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. This is the 10th anniversary, and written by Gregory Koukl, our fearless leader, our boss. And so we thought it'd be very cool to put together a little book club. And we wanted to, just by way of introduction, kind of tell you what we're not going to do in this book club and what we're going to do. Alan, do you want to give some clarification in that regard?
Yeah. Are you going to send me a copy of the book, by the way, so I can
eventually?
Okay. All right. Because until then, I'll just kind of adding my ignorance to the conversation.
That's what we
wing it. Just wing it.
Yeah, just wing it. So like Tim said, what we want to do is we're going to be us three. We'll be discussing what we think are some highlights of the book, and we'll be doing 3 chapters each week. So this week, of course, or today, right now, we'll be doing chapters 1 through 3. Next week, chapters 4, 5, and 6, and so on and so forth for the next, is it 6 weeks? I think we're doing it.
Yeah, 6 weeks.
Yeah. So each of these episodes, what we want to do is not necessarily teach the material or go through and outline the material, because the idea is we want you guys to also read the book and kind of come alongside us as we highlight what we think are important elements, maybe areas that we really like or maybe don't like as much. And then we also want to engage your comments. So if you guys have comments or questions, you can throw them in the chat, and I can't guarantee that we'll engage everyone's comments and ideas or thoughts or questions, but we'll kind of, see what we can do with some of those. Okay. So again, we're going to be highlighting and giving our insights and giving our feedback on certain aspects of those 3 chapters today, chapters 1 through 3, but not necessarily like teaching the material, because the idea is hopefully you guys can read the content with us and kind of listen in as we dialogue about some of this material. So that's kind of where we're headed.
That's good. So how about we jump in to chapter 1? Now, Alan, he said that we'll be looking at some highlights, and I was waiting for you to say lowlights as well. But there may be points throughout the book that we don't all totally agree with, and that's okay. And so we're going to give our opinions, right?
Yeah, Greg's a good guy, but
I like my job.
Yeah.
I'm gonna tell.
Yeah, we're hoping Greg's not listening into this, so we can kind of be, speak freely.
Yeah, he's too busy to watch it. Actually, what would be really cool is if we could pull him in, potentially, maybe
towards the end.
The end, last session, or maybe we do an extra session where it's
Ashton wants that. Ashton right there saying that. He say, "Will Greg make a cameo?"
Yeah, we'll get him in here. We'll pull him in. We can do that. So let's.
He lives right down the street from me.
There you go. He could be sitting right next to you,
6 feet apart, but we could do it.
That's right. Okay, so why don't we let's just start. We'll go chapter by chapter, and so let's look at chapter 1, and I'll throw the ball to you guys first, and maybe back clean up here. So John, chapter 1, was there some insight that or some practical aspect of chapter 1 that you want to highlight here?
Yeah, absolutely. I really liked how he pointed out on page 30, lessons learned. He does. Greg talks a lot about not having to have any tension or anxiety in the conversations and stuff like this, and then not to get mad during the conversation, because when you get mad or anybody else gets mad, everybody you personally don't ever win.
Yeah,
and I really appreciated that. But the thing that I took away mainly from this section, maybe not from the whole chapter, from this section, one of the main things I took away is these conversations don't have to be weird. Like, spiritual conversations don't need to be these awkward, things. For some reason, I feel like whenever you and I or any of us are trying to engage, so maybe somebody that we really love, right? Maybe not a stranger, but even a family member, we get nervous about bringing up issues of faith.
Yeah.
But why? Why? It just doesn't make sense to me. It's like, this is the most important thing to talk about. Maybe that's why. But I like how Greg really points out, using a few things that he's going to teach us throughout the book, some tactics and how to engage. We can take the pressure kind of off of ourselves. Yeah. And have it just be a normal, everyday conversation. Like you talk about the Red Sox or whatever, or the I don't know what you guys, do you guys play sports in Canada?
I never talk about the Red Sox, I'll tell you that.
Well, you should. Your life would be more full and rich. But
not much to talk about right now with sports, but yeah.
Well, but I hope you talk about Jesus, and that's what I think Greg does a really great job. Not getting mad, staying level-headed, not having to feel a tension in the conversation. That's one of the main things I pulled from it. Is that a right answer?
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I find that you're right. It's weird when it comes to religion and politics, right? People just get awkward about those kinds of conversations. And the problem is, I think for a lot of people, is they get so heated, right? There's so much disagreement. And this kind of goes, this is why the structure of the book is really helpful, because the second chapter, which we'll get to, is these reservations, like some of these challenges, why people stay away from these kinds of conversations. And I think what Greg tries to do right from the get-go is lay a foundation and say, you know what, this isn't as scary or weird or complicated as we often make it out to be.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So Alan, what about you? You got any highlights or even things you disagree with from the first chapter you want to bring up?
Yeah, Alan.
Why are you laughing?
What did you think?
No, I like what you said, John. So when I think about tactics, and as I think about when I've taught about it, what you're saying, John, is so true, that a lot of us are afraid of these conversations that are supposed to be religious in nature. And we're afraid that they're going to be awkward. We're afraid we're going to get nervous. We're afraid that we might not know the answer or know how to respond or all these things. But the whole point of tactics, the whole point of this book really is to say, even if you don't know everything there is to know about whatever subject you're talking about, and even if you are afraid or nervous or whatever, if you know these tactics, which we're going to argue are fairly straightforward things that any one of us can use, if you use these tactics, you will have the confidence to still engage people in conversation, to start those conversations, or to follow that particular maybe religious discussion that you hear starting. You'll have the confidence to engage those conversations and start them, even though you have those fears.
Yeah.
And so to me, this is why this book is so important, is because it gives you the confidence to take that step forward and engage people in conversation despite having all those fears.
Yeah.
And I would add, and I know this isn't part of chapter 1 per se, but because it's sort of like the intro chapter to the whole book, it just makes me think that one of the reasons why I also like it is because it's a system of tools that you can use on any subject with anyone. I mean, you could be talking about abortion or the resurrection or politics or religion in general. You could be talking about relativism. You could be talking about homosexuality. You could be talking about Islam. And I guarantee you that some of these tactics, if not all, could be used in a conversation on any of those subjects.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I always find that because of that, this is very powerful, and studying this material is leverage because it can apply to anything. You can use it for anything.
And so all the husbands out there should know that they can use this on their wives too.
Oh yeah, highly recommend that.
It doesn't go well. Doesn't go well, Jonathan.
It won't go well. I've done that a few times, and my wife has called me on it. She knows, she read the book too. Yeah. Don't use your tactics on me. This kind of.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. As for me, one of the highlights in the intro, and you guys touched on a couple of things that I would totally agree with, but just to add something new to the conversation, would be the ambassador model. This is kind of like a standout of Stand to Reason's this ministry that we're a part of. It's the ambassador model. How we're ambassadors for Christ. So what does that actually look like? And in the first chapter, Greg lays that out. He talks about knowledge, wisdom, and character. And what I find is, when you read books like this, apologetics books, they don't often talk about that, the last piece, the character component. Actually, not often even the wisdom component. A lot of the books that you read, and between the three of us, there's probably hundreds of books that we've read on these issues. You get a lot of content, okay? Right. And so you end up with these people who know a whole lot about some certain area, but they have no idea how to use that content. And so this is what we're talking about, what the book's about, is the wisdom aspect. So you got knowledge, an accurately informed mind, and then wisdom, which is the artful method. Okay. And then of course the character piece, which is crucial, is the attractive manner in which we engage people. And that's the part that, man, there are some people, we were just talking before we went live about discussions that can happen on the internet, and these discussions can get, people, when they get behind a keyboard, they can be jerks real easily. And this can happen to any of us because it's not a face-to-face thing. Yeah. And sometimes when we're face-to-face, we can say things we shouldn't, and because we're trying to win an argument or something like that. And so the character component, so important. And this is just a great reminder up front in the book. Keep this in mind in all of your engagements, whether they're a spiritual engagement or not. You're always an ambassador for Christ.
Yeah. And Tim, I'd also add, because tactics is principally about the wisdom component. So knowledge, wisdom, character. Tactics is about the wisdom component. However, if you use these tactics, it'll actually improve the character aspect of your conversations. So it has carryover in that sense, because obviously if you're engaging a person by asking them questions instead of just constantly making statements, that alone will make you out to be more engaging, will show that you're interested in the person, will make your conversation more interactive. And that alone will change the character component of the whole knowledge, wisdom, character. Because just remember, for those of you who are not familiar with the whole knowledge, wisdom, character thing, when Greg talks about, or when we talk about character or having good character, we're not talking specifically about having being honest or being a person of your word, which of course are all important things that we as Christians should do and have. But by character, we're talking about conversational character, meaning the manner in which we communicate should be warm and friendly and kind and gracious.
Yeah.
And so when you use these tactics, which is the wisdom component of knowledge, wisdom, character, it'll actually improve the conversational manner and the character of your conversation. So I think it's all connected. Right.
I thought it was really good. On 32, he says, finally, our character can make or break our mission. Knowledge and wisdom are packaged in a person. If that person does not embody the virtues of the sovereign she serves, she will undermine her message and handicap her efforts. And as we keep these things in mind, the knowledge, wisdom, character model, the ambassador model, it flows so nicely into when we're going to get to it eventually, the Columbo tactic and the asking questions method, where you really get to employ all of these at kind of the same time, knowledge, wisdom, and character. And that's actually what makes the conversations so easy, where we kind of started off our conversation, is when you kind of bring all these things together into a cool little package.
Yeah.
It takes the pressure off, but also like we were saying, like, why wouldn't we talk about these things? They're really important to talk about. But when you meld it all together and get it all working in a cohesive fashion, you can have a lot of fun, and you end up learning a ton. I have learned so much from talking to people that I disagree with.
Yeah.
Like really good information, not just like, how to respond to somebody, but like, oh my gosh, I've never thought of it that way. Now I need to rethink, but I'm kind of getting ahead of ourselves.
So, there's some good comments from the side chat. Jim, the strength of the approach is that it offers actual conversation because you're constantly soliciting the other person's ideas rather than delivering what can quickly feel like a pitch. That's a really good point. We're going to actually get to chapter 3, which is the Columbo tactic and how it's questions, not statements. And so you're trying to get to know what the person believes. Really good point from Andrew here. We were talking about, being careful of using them on your wife. When he taught it to his youth group, he told them, don't use tactics on your parents. Actually, I make a joke about this. When I teach this material to youth, I say, go use it on your parents, but not like, when they say, what do you want for dinner? You say, what do you mean by that? Yeah. Or, that kind of thing. Just to practice the material. And then you got Ashton here who says, I love how tactics takes the emotion out of the conversation, at least in the ambassador side. So It's true. You can really diffuse the situation using tactics. All good stuff, guys. So if you got any other questions or comments, just throw them in the chat there. I think you guys want to go to chapter 2.
Well, yeah. Let me just add one thing though that this isn't something I disagreed with per se, but it's just something that kind of struck me and made me think, I'm not sure I feel the same way. So it's something that Greg said on page 30. Page 30, yeah. So Greg has just talked about his conversation with the witch in Wisconsin, okay? And he kind of outlines that conversation and how it all went down. She's a Wiccan, she's a pagan, all that stuff. I mean, that's how he described himself. he didn't call her a pagan.
Yeah.
In case you didn't read it. Anyways, and so then he talks about one of the lessons he felt that was learned in his conversation with this witch. He says, there was no tension, no anxiety, no awkwardness in the exchange. There were no lines drawn in the sand and no one vigorously protecting their turf. There was no confrontation, no defensiveness, and no discomfort. Now, when I read that, when I read his description about the conversation about the witch in Wisconsin, I thought to myself, I'm not sure that's how I would have felt about how that conversation unfolded. And I suspect that a lot of people reading this chapter, and if they read that part, would probably think, I'm not sure if I'd feel no tension, no discomfort talking to a complete stranger who's identified herself as a witch. And now you guys are having this conversation about religion and ethics and whatever. And I know in the story, it didn't sound like that they were arguing per se, but I don't think a lot of people would experience the same sort of calmness and lack of tension that Greg might feel. And so anyways, I just want to comment that was not my initial response or my thought when he said that. I was like, no, I think there would be some tension and awkwardness. And, when you're talking to a complete stranger and you're sort of, it'll be obvious that there's some tension there.
Yeah.
And so I just don't want people to think that if you do these tactics or if you learn these tactics, that when you're in a conversation, it's always going to be at ease and calm and no tension. No, that's not necessarily true. In fact, I often find myself, even after having been using this stuff for like 2 decades, that I still experience tension and awkwardness and all that stuff when I'm in conversation. But I'll add that it's precisely because I know these tactics that it gives me the confidence to still, take the step to engage a person and not just kind of shrink back and let it go,
Yeah.
So anyways, that was my only sort of like thing that I thought to myself. I wasn't totally tracking with Greg there, but maybe that's just more his personality.
Yeah. It's good. Good stuff. So let's go to chapter 2, reservations. So this is where Greg brings up a number of challenges to getting into arguments with people. Of course, he clarifies what he means by arguments. And so we'll let's go around the table again, so to speak. John, what was a highlight for you in chapter 2?
Yeah, chapter 2, I really liked. I think Greg, I think the book really starts getting going there. I liked how he pointed out something kind of controversial, and he says it's kind of controversial on its face, where I'll just quote him, the mind, not the Bible, is the very first line of defense God has given us against error.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But like when I say it right now, I'm thinking to myself, oh, it just doesn't sound, because we put the Bible, I hold the Bible in really high regard, especially as far as truth goes. But we have to learn how to use our minds before we can even understand what the Bible says. And certainly before we can even defend what it says. So I really enjoyed that. The ability to argue well is vital for clear thinking. That's why arguments are good things. Arguing is a virtue because it helps us hold to what is true and discard what is false. Anyways, I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed this whole chapter, but specifically that section, that we need to learn how to argue. We need to be using our minds. We need to be thoughtful. Yeah. And that's actually part of what I think what leads to, like we started out, the character portion, right? So when I see character kind of jettisoned, or when people leave it at the door, I feel like it's oftentimes, and I'm just going to maybe throw this out there, you guys can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but it's because we sometimes don't use our minds. We just like resort to easy aphorisms or Christianisms, or, we say these short, pithy little statements that we think somehow gains traction or wins the conversation, but it just, when you think about them, it just doesn't. And we haven't really thought through the issues. Mm-hmm. So the mind is really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good, John. What about you, Alan?
That was also the correct answer, John, just like your first one.
Oh, 2 for 2. I never did this well in school.
You're on a roll, dude. I don't know why you're so insecure about this.
Thank God.
So actually the thing that stood out to me in this chapter was something that John mentioned from chapter 1 that Greg just kind of mentioned briefly in chapter 1, but then kind of expanded in chapter 2. And that is the concept that if you're in a conversation with somebody about your faith, about your convictions, and then someone gets mad in the conversation, well, then you lose, right? And his point is, it doesn't matter who it is. Like, obviously, if you get mad, you're going to lose because you're going to scowl, you're going to get angry, you're going to start shouting, you'll cut the other person off. You're just going to be a jerk, right? A jerk for Jesus kind of thing. But of course, if the other person gets mad, well, then, of course, then you lose as well, because now they're defensive, they're angry, and obviously under those circumstances, they're not going to be as willing to consider your points in a reasonable way, or, they're going to be thinking that you're the enemy, you're the bad guy, and like you're just trying to, push through on some issues. So I just thought that was really helpful, and I think that that's often a reason why our conversations or engagements fail. Even if somebody isn't like visibly angry and shouting, if they're still angry inside about what you're saying, then I mean, it's just so little it can be done. Now, I guess the important qualification would be, and Greg makes this point as well, and I forgot what page this was on, but
I have the entire book memorized. Just
sorry, you can find what page it was on where he makes this point. But the qualification I'd make about the whole people getting angry is that sometimes you'll make your point, you'll say it clearly, you'll say it as charitably as possible, as graciously as possible, and the person will still get angry. Yeah. And and that's just because sometimes, no matter how kind and thoughtful and considerate and gracious you are, the truth is just going to upset people. And of course, we know that's the case because even in the day of Jesus, right, when Christ was speaking, I mean, he would say things, we would say in the most appropriate way possible, and yet people still went ballistic, right? And so the point is that it's not that every time somebody gets angry because of your poor character or you're being a jerk. It could just be that the very nature of the truth being spoken just incites them to anger, But we want to be mindful of the fact that it's possible also that sometimes the manner in which we say those things could unnecessarily anger somebody, and that's what we want to be mindful of. And that's, of course, the main point Greg's making there. Yeah,
good.
There was before I tell you the highlights from me. There's a couple people who echoed what you said, Alan, earlier about using tactics and using it for years and still feeling a level of anxiety. And this is what Chris says here. Talking to parents and friends, there seemed to be a level of tension. So there that thing that idea, and I'm the same way, man. The heart starts pounding in these conversations, even though on the outside, people may say, "You look like you kept your cool." But on the inside, you're still feeling that tension, right? It's not like, oh, it's so light and breezy. Right. Typically, unless you're a certain kind of person, a certain kind of personality, like Greg, that may be Greg.
Well, I think there's also an instance like there's a truth to becoming you got to be comfortable with that, with the tension.
Yeah.
You become comfortable with it. And I kind of sometimes, to be honest with you guys, I kind of enjoy the conflict and the tension in the conversation. My background is law, so like I love arguing.
Yeah.
And it's fun for me. It's not that, and then that brings in that's why it's so important to be grounded in the ambassador model, knowledge, wisdom, character. Because for somebody like me, it's really easy for me to seem like I'm being overly aggressive, or I'm a big guy as it is, so I can kind of throw that around without.
You intimidate me like crazy when I'm standing next to you.
I know we've talked about this. I'm really sorry.
I know,
and I'm trying to soften my approach. Well,
just flex a little bit less when we're around.
I have to rely on muscle. You have beauty, so you can woo people with your eyes.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure.
But I think that
look.
I love that this is a topic of conversation, though, because getting comfortable with that tension really helps too. This is why, like William Lane Craig, for example, I'm sure when he's up there debating, I'm sure he's, well, maybe not, but I'm sure there's points where he's nervous, and but he has a plan. He sticks to that plan. It also, somewhere in this chapter, sorry, Tim, I kind of took your time, but like somewhere I think in this chapter, he says that, or maybe the next one, the Christians had a great advantage because we have the true story of reality.
Yeah.
Right.
It helps.
It's a different book.
Well, it leads to a different book. I think he had that in mind. Greg always has the next step in mind.
Yeah. That's true.
So Tim, what did you like from this chapter?
Okay, I'll tell you.
You only got 5 seconds though, because John took most of your time.
Yeah,
I'm really sorry.
I'm getting that.
I'll repent
so
later.
I'll tell you what. I'll tell you the number one thing when I do talks on this. I'll tell you the one thing that people come up to me afterwards and say, okay, this changed it for me. And that was the idea of the modest goal, what Greg calls the modest goal. This is on page 46.
Was
He
that
starts
this
talking
chapter?
about this. And anyone familiar with Greg's talk or one of our talks on this would know the modest goal that we talk about is you don't have to hit home runs. You don't even have to get on base. He's like, just step up to the plate and start swinging. And what we say is, your goal in every conversation is to put a stone in someone's shoe. Okay. And so that for a lot of people, that's like, you're kidding me. That's all I have to do in a conversation. Yeah. Just put a stone in the shoe, get them walking away annoyed, but in a good way. Like as if you put a physical stone in the shoe, the person can't stop thinking. They got to deal with the stone in the shoe. And so I want them thinking about our conversation. So whatever that is, maybe it's a question I asked. So it doesn't have to necessarily be the gospel in every conversation. Now I know this rubs some people the wrong way, especially, and this is going to go to my next point, the point about gardening and harvesting. This is such a cool illustration. It's not unique to Greg. Obviously, Jesus is the one who makes this illustration in John 4. He talks about reapers and sowers. Okay. And Greg expands on this, gardeners and harvesters. He says there's one team, there's one field, but there's two seasons. Okay. There's gardeners and harvesters. And sometimes the season of gardening is happening. And other times there's a season of harvest. And there's two kinds of people. There's gardeners and there's harvesters. And so there's some people, and I think, John, I feel like you're a harvester. Okay. You're the kind of guy, and this is just, I mean, we didn't talk about this, but just from my conversations with you, you have no trouble getting to the gospel or leading off with the gospel or telling people. But I mean, it is like, it's a part of who you are, to share the gospel. And so I would consider John, as he has no problem being a harvester. He does gardening too, obviously, but he's a harvester.
Yeah.
There's other people, and Greg, he would come out and say, he's a gardener. In fact, he starts his talk by saying, and he didn't do this in the book, but he'll say, I've been a Christian it's been 30 years since I led a person to Christ. And everybody in the room gasps, it's
what a failure.
Yeah. And he'll even say, he'll be like, what a loser. But he'll say, no, my job has been in gardening. Yeah. And Jesus says the reapers and the sowers, the gardeners and the harvesters, they rejoice together because they're on the same team. And so, I mean, you can read more about that illustration, but to me, that put things in perspective for me. So you got the stone in the shoe and the gardening and the harvesting. And for me, those two things, came together, and it helps me be more productive, because when I'm in a conversation, I don't think I have to go for the close. I'm just going to be productive, put a stone in the shoe.
Right. That's actually one of I'm really glad Greg, the presentation, especially when he speaks on this, says it the way that he does. And I think Greg is very careful with his words. He's a really great writer. Yeah. Because this is a part that I actually, I read that and I kind of cringe a little bit, because I'm in that camp where when you say, oh, I don't need to necessarily get to the gospel. Like there's something in me that's just like, oh man, but that's the goodness, that's the good stuff. But I understand the sentiment behind it. And when I let that challenge me, the first time I read this, the first time I read this was about 10 years ago. And I was a volunteer at my local church. And I actually ended up buying a copy of this for every student in our youth group, because this was back when I used to make money. And because it was so valuable, and this is a main point, Tim, that you're drawing out, that really challenged me as a believer. And I think God has gifted me with evangelism. Like I like being an evangelist and talking about Jesus to people. But it's allowed me to be challenged and kind of temper that with, like all I need to do is give this person something to think about, because ultimately the responsibility of conversion isn't on me anyway. Yeah. And Greg is very clear about this, because I think he's probably gotten so much pushback on that. that he's very clear. He's like, well, apart from the Holy Spirit, there's no such thing as conversion. Like there. So just take that weight off of you. And that's what it did for me. It totally took the weight off of me. I didn't feel like I had to convert anybody. This is what it made. It made the difference from I have to talk to somebody about the gospel to, wow, I hope I get the opportunity to talk to somebody about the gospel.
Yeah.
Right.
And if that happens right then and there in that conversation, or one a year from now, fantastic. And I think God's rewarded that in my own life, and trying to be a more thoughtful evangelist, trying to be kind of out there. So I really appreciated that part of this chapter.
Yeah.
That's good, John. For those who've read the book would know, Greg talks about 100% God, 100% man. So, we take care of our side. We leave it for God to take care of his side. Really good stuff. All right. I'm looking at the clock, 35. Okay. So let's do chapter 3. Chapter 3, there's not a ton here. And of course, this is starting Columbo, and we're going to get into the specifics of the Columbo tactic in chapter 4 and 5 and 6. And so let's kind of do a speed round here. Was there something in chapter 3 called Getting the Driver's Seat that you think is particularly valuable, or something you want to highlight?
It's kind of like a sum of almost what we've been talking about. On 55, it says the very last sentence, or second to last sentence, each of these questions is an invitation to thoughtful dialogue. And that's really what it's all about. Leading in a conversation, just trying to have a conversation with somebody like they're a normal human being, which I really enjoy doing.
Yeah. I think, the main thrust of the whole book, the whole chapter, is really the power of questions, right?
Yeah.
That's the main takeaway I got from it. Obviously he's introducing Columbo, the actual lieutenant or detective, whatever, you know what I mean? But Columbo and his style, and so where he gets the idea from, where he gets the name from, and then just giving examples of how questions are powerful, right? Talking about how they're engaging, how they're interactive, how they have all these other benefits, and then and I don't remember him mentioning this in this chapter. Maybe he does somewhere else. I can't remember, but I know I say this, and I know you guys do as well. But the quote from Francis Schaeffer is the one that always pops into my mind when I read this chapter, where Schaeffer says, "If I have only an hour with someone, I'll spend the first 55 minutes asking them questions and finding out what is troubling their heart and their mind. And then the last 5 minutes, I'll share something of the truth." Right. And to me, that really captures the thrust of chapter 3, because it puts questions where they need to be. And that is at the heart of all of the tactics. Right? And this is the foundational point behind everything that the book is about.
Yeah.
So to me, that's just huge, that at its core, the queen mother of all tactics, the Columbo tactic, is to ask a question rather than making a statement when you're trying to move forward in a conversation about your faith.
And just going off that, man, it's hard for me to, at least it was originally, someone would say, I was in teachers college, I was learning this material, reading the book. Someone would say something like, God does not exist. And there was actually a very evangelistic style atheist. And so he was handing out atheist literature, DVDs, the Zeitgeist movie, like this kind of stuff. And seriously, and it was wild. And I never met anyone like this who was so upfront about his atheism. And it was, he would make a claim like that. And I always thought it was my job to do all the defending. Right.
Right.
And so I would make statements and, oh no, he does it. They say he doesn't exist. I'd say, oh yes, he does, this kind of thing. And so just the question model. And then of course, Greg points back to Jesus. This was his tool of choice with friend and foe alike, right? This is what Jesus used, questions. I mean, a whole Bible study is right there. If anyone's listening, and wants to try this at home, go through the Gospels and just comb through the questions. Jesus used them over and over and over again.
I think there's 284 documented questions in just the Gospels.
Wow. So this is Jesus. This is how he responded to people who were friend and foe. And so sometimes people were trying to trap him. He'd respond with a question. But he also got the disciples, his friends, to think about their own worldview, to think about who he is and who God is through the power of questions. I like how you mentioned Francis Schaeffer, who has impacted Greg Koukl a lot, and who wrote this book. But Blaise Pascal, he says that people are better persuaded by the reasons which they themselves discover than by those which come into their minds by others. So what he's saying there is, if I just tell you believe in God, here's why, you're likely to, put your guard up. But if I can maybe ask a question like, where do you think the moral law comes from? Or what's the cause of the universe? Or, these big questions, and get you to think for yourself about them, then you're likely to change. You're likely to come to the conclusion yourself, right? So that's the power of the Columbo approach, which, by the way, we're going to go into a lot more detail on these questions, and it might be fun next week to actually have some people in the chat put in potential challenges, and we can respond with some questions. But what if we, just for the next 4 minutes or so, see if does anyone have any questions specifically to what we've been talking about. If you want to type those in to the chat, we can see those, and we can pull them up and respond. So now would be a good time to do that. I know there's been a lot of discussion here.
In the meantime, too, if we want, we can just comment on what some people said. Like Josh Morris there, where he talked about, he mentions the whole harvesting, gardening thing. And he says, I used to feel, because it takes some of the guilt that we put on ourselves. He says, I used to feel, oh, there it is. I was such a lame-o, and that God was upset with me because I never mentioned God in his talks about morality and free will determination. And this allowed me to take a weight off my shoulder. Like, that's so much the point of the whole putting a stone in their shoe, is that we feel, Christians create this more impossible burden on ourselves, this task. Like, unless we do X, Y, and Z in the conversation, we're a total failure. Yeah. Whereas, as Greg points out, and as you were describing, Tim, if we just make it a goal, a more modest goal to put a stone in their shoe, I think this is so key. So I appreciate that.
Here's also a comment from Rick here. He said the same thing applies when you come to the realization you don't have to know the answer to every question. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of people who won't even speak up in conversations because they think, well, I have to know the answer. But the tactical approach is it's so different. You don't have to have all the answers. You can know nothing. You're just, the first Columbo question is just an information gathering mode. You're trying to get an education in this process, right? Mm-hmm. And you can just cut it off right there. You don't have to go any further. So,
and I would add, if you are in a conversation though, and you are using the Columbo tactic, but it does go down eventually to the point where now they're raising a challenge against your view, or they have asked you a question and you feel like you got to give an answer. Even if you don't know the answer, that's fine. What I do is I just first of all, I acknowledge their point. I say, hey, that's a good question. That's a good argument. I haven't heard that before. So I acknowledge that they've presented a good question or argument. And then I just simply ask them if I can get back to them at a later date. I say, can I just chew on that for like a day or something, and think about it. And then usually I'll just go home and I'll research the question or research the topic and kind of figure out like how I want to respond. And then the next time I see them, I'm like, hey, I was thinking about what you said. And then I just kind of give my response at that point. So even if it comes to the point where an objection's been raised, you've had the whole Columbo conversation, and now you're at the point where there is some element in which you have to say something, but you don't know what to say. It's okay to just say, I don't know right now, but can I just think about it for a little while and get back to you?
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever had anybody say to me, no, Alan, unless you can answer right now, you're a total loser, which maybe they thought that, but that never happens, right? People are like, sure, go home and think about it. What's the big deal?
Yeah.
That's good. That's good.
That is good. That is good. It's also just one more point is that like, we're not the only people who have to answer questions. I mean, every worldview is responsible coming up with a cohesive answer to life's fundamental questions: origin, meaning, purpose, destiny, values, stuff like that. And I think the art of the tactics helps move the burden of proof. It doesn't allow somebody to shift the burden back onto us. Like the Christian isn't responsible for answering every question under the sun. There's the other people have to answer too. So I think that this is good.
And that'll come up. We'll talk a lot about that, John, chapter
next week, right?
Yeah, chapter 5. Yep. Reverse and burden proof. So that'll be huge.
A bunch of things just came in here. Chris, do any of you use role play in your teaching to help people become more comfortable navigating through conversations?
All the time.
Yeah. Definitely.
All the time.
Well, yes. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Alan.
Well, I was going to say so it depends on how much time is given during the teaching. So if I'm just doing like a 45-minute thing, I typically don't do a ton of role play. But if I'm given 2 hours, for example, or more than an hour and 15 minutes, what I'll do is after I teach each section of the Columbo tactic, like, Columbo, the first application, or Columbo, the second application, or Columbo, the third application, I'll teach it and I'll say, okay, let's break up into pairs or into small groups. And then I'll have a thing on the screen which will show a number of different hypothetical objections. And then I'll just have them role play the tactic that I just taught. So that's one way I do it.
Yeah, that's good.
And if I only have like 45 minutes for a presentation, then I'll just have them. And I know Chris is asking this because I know Chris. Hey, Chris. And I know he teaches this content too. So he's actually a Canadian. Do you know him? You don't know him, Tim. You have to meet him. He's a friend of mine.
I'll have to meet him.
Because all Canadians know every other Canadian.
He's in Vancouver Island, though, so he's not close to you.
You know what? I may have met Chris. We'll have to see.
Well, anyways, we're talking about another time. But anyways, yeah. So if I only have like 45 minutes or 50 minutes, instead of breaking out into small groups, I'll just have them maybe just respond as a group to me when I'm up front. So I'll have a list on the screen. Darwinian evolution is true. Okay, then I'd point and say, hey, how would you respond to this using Columbo 1 or 2 or whatever?
Yeah.
So
this is a good exercise. I mean, even not just teaching, but if parents are listening, why not next time you're sitting down for a meal, maybe tomorrow at dinner, just put a statement out and see how your kids respond. And then you can kind of show them that the Columbo approach is the best approach. So you're doing a little role play at the table. That might be helpful. Good way to educate. Yeah. Paula here says, talking about questions. It's so honest, shows that you have an open heart to have dialogue with them. And that's so true. Again, these are not, and Greg goes through this, this is not games. We're not playing games. We really care about the answers to the questions we're asking. Okay. It's not a clever ruse. It's not trying to manipulate.
And we should care about the person too, who we're asking up. Yeah.
That's right. The reason
I'm not saying you weren't doing that.
Yeah.
Tim's working on that.
Tim's working. We all know where he struggles, but
good call. Josh, do you guys have any tips on how to fix my face? I have terrible facials and it comes off hostile sometimes.
You mean like expressions?
Yeah, like facial expressions.
Okay. Well, I was thinking like facials. I'm like, well, go to a different salon. Like, I don't know.
No, it's something you need to be aware of, though. I've actually, we've been doing these Zoom meetings with family and stuff, and my sister, there's a bunch of us, and one of my sisters kind of looked angry, and someone stopped and was like, "Heather, are you angry?" And they're like, and she's like, no, like she smiled. She's like, "No, that was my resting face or whatever. That was my thinking face." And my wife has told me that my thinking face is kind of aggressive. So I've had to actually think about, okay, Tim, smile while you're thinking, because sometimes when things are going through your head, you don't have that, normal smile you have or whatever.
Yeah.
So
the tips would be, the illustration you're giving, Tim, is just ask for feedback from people. So that'd be one thing that you could do. Number 2, I suppose, now that we're in a pandemic and everyone's using, Zoom and other kinds of, video conferencing software, we're actually more likely to see. Like I have noticed myself, I'm like, oh yeah, I do kind of have a weird face when I do such and such, you know. So that'll automatically provide feedback, you know, just video conferencing more often than you do normally, you know. But yeah, I mean, like anything, you have to. I mean, I think it's hard for us as Christians to give critical feedback in love, because people don't typically like to give critical feedback to people. We think that's not kind or whatever. But the best way to get it is to ask for it. So, I mean, this wouldn't apply just to facial expressions, but to anything, you know. Invite people to give you feedback, and that'll be one of the best ways. And, you know, of course, ask of people who you care about or know that they care about you. And I think that's one of the best ways to get feedback on those things and help change areas where you're having issues with.
A good one. So our friend Scott Kelly, he says, just curious about why you think Christians do that to themselves, making evangelism harder than it is, always having to close the deal, etc. The last class I did on tactics, I always had a hard time at the beginning of the class to have the students tell stories of how they used tactics the week before, and rarely did I get a response. They still seem nervous about having the conversations.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where practicing and providing a safe environment for people to practice that is key. You know, practice it at home. Kind of like what you said in jest a little bit, Tim, but like do practice it on your parents if you're a student, or if you're a parent, practice it on your kids, or in teaching them how to do this stuff. And in youth group or whatnot, you know, bring them out and get them out there doing it. You know, I got the great opportunity of doing, I went with Brett Koukl Maven to Berkeley, California, and just trained a bunch of students on how to ask these types of questions, you know, to complete strangers, and just giving these students the opportunity in a confined, safe environment, and then doing breakout critiques. Mm-hmm. I saw students, I mean, it's amazing what these students did. You know, I was partnered with one girl who she was a senior in college, and the idea of talking to somebody about God, just the idea, had her break down in tears. So, you know, just very comforting, just say, hey, you don't need to do anything you don't want to do. You're cool. Just watch me how I'm going to do it. Watch your classmate, how they're going to do it. By the third day, she was arguing she was arguing the moral law with a professor at Berkeley. And wow. the professor, you get this, this is like this sweet, like pretty young girl. Like she's just like so innocent looking. And she's talking to this professor, and the professor's like, there's no such thing as a moral law. And she said, okay, well, what if I had this little puppy, and the puppy was really annoying? And but cute little puppy, but I poured gasoline all over the puppy and I lit the puppy on fire. Would you say that's mean or wrong? And I was like, oh my gosh, how'd you say this? It was just cool to see her, but giving her the environment to practice and fail a little bit. You know, don't be afraid to get out there and fail. I learned so much more from getting beat up than I do from, you know, engaging in people who just kind of roll over. You know, I learned how to, you know, everything from tone to technique to facts, you know, getting the practice. That's a really good question.
Yeah. Well, we've had, unless there's something else you guys want to respond to, there's been so much good stuff in the chat. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything. The original plan was to do 30 minutes. And that turned into 45, and that turned into almost 55. So I think we're going to cut it off here. We really appreciate everyone who stuck around and was involved in the chat. It actually made for a really stimulating conversation. Great comment, questions. Do you guys have any parting thoughts before we go?
Jesus loves you.
There's that harvester coming out. Every time he's got to close the deal.
That's right. I would just say if you don't have the book or haven't had a chance to read it, this is the time. You know, we're going to be spending the next 5 weeks from now going through it. So it'd be fun to have you guys go through it with us.
So next week, Sunday, 6 p.m. Pacific time, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to look at chapters 4, 5, and 6, which all have to specifically do with the Columbo tactic. And it's going to be a lot of fun. It's really the meat of the book. So really this was just an introduction, laying the groundwork, but man, next week is going to be fun. And I'm thinking about ways that we can involve people in the chat more. And so if you bring some tough questions or statements, claims, actually that would be the best part. If we got some claims and then we can kind of model how to respond to some of the challenges. That is, if people want that kind of help.
Because that's what the tactics are. I mean, they're specifically meant to respond. And so we just show how these tactics work and apply to those things.
Yeah. Be fun, guys.
Yeah.
It will be fun.
Man,
thanks.
I really enjoyed hanging with you guys. We should do this more often.
I know.
It was all right.
We should work together.
All right, guys.
Work together.
Take care. We love you. And remember, Stand to Reason is here for all of you.
And so is Jesus.
That was so sweet.
All right. Peace, guys.
You bald people are so touching. All right. See you guys.